Have you ever received a call that gave you chills? Imagine waking up every night at 2 a.m. to the phone ringing insistently. On the other end, there's hellish static and screams that sound like a nightmare. This is the real and terrifying account we're going to explore today. In this video, you'll find out how my brother faced an unexplainable terror, changing phone numbers and even carriers, only to discover that the calls persisted. And what happens when the mysterious calls start haunting our mother too? Get ready for a story that mixes the unknown and the terrifying in a way you've never seen before. Are you ready to unravel this dark mystery and find out what happened when my brother decided to call back? If you've ever had an unexplainable experience or simply love real horror stories, stay with us and discover how a simple phone call changed our lives forever. I've always been very close to my brother, Lucas. We were inseparable as kids, and even as adults, our connection remained strong. We lived in different cities, but talked almost every day. Lucas was always in a good mood, playful and positive, even when facing life's challenges. It all started on a regular night. Lucas called me, and his voice sounded different, filled with a nervousness I had never heard before. He said that, for the past few nights, he'd been getting strange calls on his cell phone, always around 2 or 3 a.m. He said that when he answered, all he could hear was a hellish sound. It was like radio static mixed with distant, agonizing screams. On the first night, Lucas thought it was some kind of prank. He answered and heard that horrible mix of sounds, hanging up quickly. On the second night, the call came at the exact same time. This time, he answered and listened carefully, trying to identify something beyond the chaotic noise. Nothing. Just that infernal static and screams that seemed to come from a distant nightmare. On the third night, the call came again. Lucas, already annoyed and a bit scared, decided not to answer. But the phone rang insistently. It called 3, 4, 5 times, until he finally gave in and answered. The same terrifying sound. He hung up again, his heart racing and his mind full of unanswered questions. The calls continued every night. Lucas started losing sleep, always waiting for the phone to ring, which left him more and more terrified. He described the experience as surreal, like being stuck in an endless horror movie. He couldn't understand why this was happening to him or what it meant. I heard all of this over the phone, trying to calm my brother and find some logic in the situation. But deep down, I was scared too. Something about that sound felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain. And that's how our nightmare began, with calls no one could imagine where they came from or why they happened. After a whole month of being tormented by the mysterious calls, Lucas decided it was time to take more drastic measures. He had tried everything, blocking unknown numbers, moving the phone to different locations during the night, even turning the phone off completely. Nothing worked. Every time he answered, that hellish sound was there, waiting to invade his peace. Finally, exhausted and desperate, Lucas decided to change his number. He went to the phone carrier and explained the situation, though he was reluctant to detail the disturbing nature of the calls. He got a new number and went home feeling relieved, as if he had left a nightmare behind. On the first night with the new number, Lucas slept peacefully for the first time in weeks. The phone didn't ring. Nor did it on the second night, or the third. It seemed the change had worked. Lucas began to recover the lost sleep and his peace of mind. We thought that finally, that dark chapter of his life was over. But then, exactly a week later, the nightmare started again. It was 2:15 a.m. when the phone rang. Lucas woke up with a start, his heart racing. He looked at the screen and saw an unknown number. He hesitated for a moment, dreading what he might hear, but finally answered. The sound was back. The same unbearable static, the same distant, agonizing screams. Lucas felt a chill down his spine and an indescribable terror realizing that even with a new number, the calls hadn't stopped. It was as if something or someone was pursuing him, something that couldn't be avoided just by changing a phone number. The next night, the phone rang again at the same time. Lucas answered and heard the same disturbing sound. The infernal routine had started over, bringing back all the fear and anxiety he thought he had left behind. He tried calling back, but this time, the number seemed inactive or the call wouldn't go through. The situation began to affect him deeply. Lucas was no longer the playful and optimistic person he used to be. He was always tired, with deep dark circles under his eyes, and his nervousness was evident in every gesture. The nightly calls had become a nightmare he couldn't escape, and the shadow of that hellish sound seemed more present than ever. Determined to find out what was happening, we decided that the next time the call came, Lucas would call back immediately. It was an attempt to face the problem head-on, to understand the source of the torment. The next night, as usual, the phone rang at 2 a.m. Lucas answered, listened to the hellish sound for a few seconds, and hung up. Taking a deep breath, he dialed the number that appeared on the caller ID. After a few rings, an old, fragile voice answered on the other end. It was an elderly man, whose voice sounded confused and disoriented. Lucas tried to explain the situation, asking why he was calling and causing those disturbing sounds in the middle of the night. However, the old man seemed to have no idea what Lucas was talking about. He muttered incoherent things, talking about trivial matters and confusing memories of times past. Lucas grew frustrated, trying to get some useful information, but the conversation went nowhere. "I don't know what you're talking about, son. I don't make calls at this hour," said the old man, his voice full of confusion and fatigue. Lucas realized that the man wasn't responsible for the calls. He hung up the phone with a mix of despair and frustration, feeling like he was being pulled deeper into an endless abyss of mystery. Even after this attempt to uncover the source of the calls, they did not stop. Every night, without fail, the phone rang at the same time. If Lucas answered, the hellish sound was there, always the same. If he ignored the call, the phone continued to ring insistently, once, twice, 3 times. It seemed nothing could stop that infernal cycle. Lucas's nights became a constant torture. He began to fear the sunset, knowing that the arrival of dawn would bring another night of terror. The sound of static and screams was etched into his mind, haunting him even during the day. He tried turning off the phone, but the calls continued to echo in his dreams, making it impossible to find any peace. With no messages left, no concrete clues, just the relentless harassment of that disturbing sound, Lucas felt more exhausted and helpless each night, as if he was being slowly consumed by a nightmare that refused to end. And so, the nights became an endless torment, each call a reminder that something inexplicable and terrifying was lurking, ready to strip away any shred of sanity he still had. Lucas was on the verge of collapse. The nightly calls had become a constant, unbearable burden he could no longer carry. In a final act of desperation, he decided that changing his number wasn't enough. Maybe, he thought, the problem lay with the phone carrier itself. So he made the decision to terminate his contract with his current carrier and switch to a new one, hoping this would finally put an end to his torment. It was a complicated and time-consuming process, but Lucas was determined. He explained his situation to the new carrier's customer service representatives, without going into too much detail about the disturbing nature of the calls, and got a new number. Once again, he returned home with a mix of relief and apprehension, desperately hoping this would solve his problem. For the first few days, peace seemed to have been restored. Lucas slept soundly, without any interruptions in the middle of the night. He began to regain his energy, feeling more like himself again. But this tranquility was short-lived. About a week after switching carriers, the phone rang again. It was 2:10 a.m. Lucas woke up with a racing heart and, with a sense of inevitability, answered the call. The sound was there. The same hellish static, the same agonizing screams. The terror took hold of him once more. The calls hadn't ended, they had only taken a brief pause before returning with the same disturbing intensity. The persistence of the calls began to affect Lucas in deep and devastating ways. Sleepless nights became routine, and the fatigue started to reflect in all aspects of his life. He began arriving late to work, his productivity plummeted, and mistakes started to pile up. His boss noticed the change, and despite Lucas's attempts to explain the situation without sounding insane, the understanding was limited. His co-workers also noticed the transformation. Lucas, who had once been playful and sociable, became a somber and reserved man, with deep dark circles under his eyes and a constantly frightened expression. The jokes and concerned comments soon turned into murmurs of pity and speculation. And then, the inevitable happened. After a month of poor performance and constant absences, Lucas lost his job. It was a devastating blow, but he couldn't find the strength to care. Losing his job was just another addition to the growing list of things the calls had destroyed. Without a job and income, Lucas couldn't keep his phone for long. He had to disconnect the line, leaving him even more isolated. The calls ceased, but the psychological impact remained. He lived in constant fear that his mother's phone or any nearby device might start ringing with that horrible sound. The nights, once haunted by the calls, were now filled with nightmares of static and screams, a persistent echo of a torment that seemed never-ending. Lucas became a shadow of his former self, a man haunted by a mystery he couldn't comprehend or escape. And I, watching from the outside, felt a mix of despair and helplessness, unable to help him or find answers to what we were facing. When Lucas finally lost his phone, there was a brief sense of relief. The hellish calls that tormented him every night finally stopped. Without the phone, there was no more static and screaming to invade his sleep. For the first time in months, he was able to sleep without being interrupted by that auditory nightmare. During these weeks of silence, Lucas began to recover slowly. He was still unemployed, but without the calls, his mind seemed less tormented. The dark circles under his eyes began to fade, and his mood improved slightly. We all breathed a little easier, believing the worst was over and that disconnecting the phone had finally broken the infernal cycle. It was on a quiet afternoon that the illusion of peace was shattered. My mother was in the kitchen preparing dinner when the house phone rang. It wasn't common for us to receive calls at that hour, but no one thought much of it. My mother answered with her usual warm hello, but what followed made her face turn pale instantly. She heard the same hellish static and distant screams that Lucas had been describing. Trembling, she called my name. I rushed to the kitchen and found her holding the phone, eyes wide with fear. I took the receiver and, placing it to my ear, was immediately engulfed by the disturbing sound. It was exactly as Lucas had described. I hung up the phone with a growing sense of panic. My heart raced as my mind tried to process what this meant. When Lucas heard what had happened, he was even more desolate. He had been convinced he had left the nightmare behind, but now, not only was he being dragged back into it, but our mother was being pulled into that abyss of terror as well. We tried calling back the number that had appeared on the caller ID, but as before, the call wouldn't go through. The number seemed non-existent, and every attempt was met with a disconnected signal. From that moment on, the atmosphere in our house changed drastically. Every ring of the phone became a cause for alarm. We lived with the constant tension that the calls could resume at any moment, not just for Lucas, but for any of us. The sense of security that our home once provided was replaced by a silent, constant fear. And so the terror that had once been confined to Lucas began to spread, enveloping all of us in an endless nightmare. When Lucas heard about the call our mother had received, the color drained from his face. He looked like a man on the brink of total collapse, his eyes wide and filled with a terror I had never seen before. He took the phone from her trembling hands and listened to the message, the hellish static and distant screams echoing through the line. It was as if all the fear and anguish of the past months came rushing back to him at once. Lucas fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face as he desperately tried to understand why this was happening. Why is this happening to us?" he repeated incessantly, as if some answer might emerge from the darkness that surrounded us. We tried to console him, but his despair was palpable, a tangible entity that threatened to engulf us as well. Determined to face the nightmare one last time, Lucas tried to return the call again. Using the house phone, he dialed the number that had appeared on the caller ID, the same combination of digits that had brought so much terror. Each ring of the phone felt like a hammer pounding in our hearts. Finally, after a few seconds of agonizing silence, the call connected. But instead of static and screams, what he heard was a cold, impersonal recording. "The number you have dialed does not exist." Lucas tried several times, but it was always the same response. He felt powerless, defeated by something he couldn't understand or control. The call that had brought so much fear now revealed an even greater enigma, one without a resolution. The mystery of the calls was never solved. The calls ceased as abruptly as they had begun, but their impact left indelible marks on our family. Lucas was never the same. The trauma and constant fear turned him into a shadow of the man he once was. His joy and optimism were replaced by deep distrust and anxiety that never fully went away. For my mother and me, the experience left us shaken as well. The sound of static and screams became a ghost that hovered over our home, a constant reminder that something inexplicable and terrifying had invaded our lives. We came to fear the phone ringing, each call bringing a chill, even if it was from a friend or relative. We never discovered who or what was behind the calls. It was as if a fragment of hell had found its way into our world, determined to torment us without any apparent reason. The lack of answers only heightened the terror, leaving us with a sense of vulnerability that we never completely overcame. The nightmare of the hellish calls taught us that not all mysteries have solutions, and that some shadows are so deep that no light can dispel them. We live with the memory of that sound, the static, and the screams, an invisible scar we carry forever. And in a way, the unknown is what scares us the most, what leaves the deepest mark, because it reminds us that there are things beyond our comprehension, always lurking, always ready to find us, even in the safety of our homes.